So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today we have an amazing array of people who are joining us from across the country, from the shores of Newfoundland to the shores of BC and places of all places in between. We'd like to start today with a land acknowledgement. This is the land acknowledgement for where the Atkinson Centre is on Turtle Island. We hope you'll take the time to acknowledge your relationship to First People and whatever lands you live and work on. Thank you. Now, we're going to do something that's called an icebreaker, because I have this feeling that you all will not know one another. So you're going to find yourself in a room with two or three other people. You've got 3 minutes here. It's only 1 minute each. Your name, your location, and your favorite childcare memory, whatever that may be, and from whatever position you had it in. So can we do that, please? I hope that you had an opportunity there to meet somebody new. And again, thank you for joining us today, for have your say about what we would like to see in Canada's childcare legislation. Olivia, do you want to put that onto full screen? I think we're seeing some of the sidebar there. Okay, so we know that the federal government is planning legislation. They said that they would do it in their budget. It's in the minister's letter. The details are sparse, but officials tell us that legislation would encompass the existing early learning and childcare agreements that have been negotiated with provinces and territories, and that the intent of the legislation is to ensure Canadians and the provinces and territories of the federal government's ongoing commitment to facilitate the building of a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare. So we have two guests to help us, with the discussions that we're going to have here. They will be known to you quite well, I'm sure. Olivia Chow, when she was Member of Parliament, was part of introducing not one but two bills to the House of Commons so that Canada could have an Early Learning and Childcare Act. And Stephen Shyrman, who is a lawyer, assisted Olivia in drafting those bills, and he continues to be a resource to stakeholders now. So I'm just going to ask you to put up that slide, which details what the introduction to the 2009 bill was, and we'll put into the chat the link to that bill, because I think that there's still quite a bit in it which is relevant. And I'm going to ask Olivia to talk about that. So what went into getting those bills tabled? And do you think that they're still relevant? And if there's anything in them, what do you think needs to be updated given today's environment?
Good morning, or good afternoon to some of you. And wonderful to see all of you. And feel free to put your comments into chat, because we have two chat monitors, so that any questions you have will capture it and answered at the end. Wonderful to see you all. Yes, I first introduced that bill. It was at that time called Bill 303. And the aim, and then in 2009, I reintroduced it in another parliament. both of them were minority government, so that the bill passed second reading and went to committee. What I did at the time, why I wanted to do that, was to establish a framework to make sure that we have a high quality, universally available, affordable, and accessible and nonprofit childcare and early learning. And why was it important? Because earlier on in 2000, there was a chunk of money that went to the provinces at the time, but the problem was that a lot of the provinces weren't spending it on childcare. And then there was the multilateral framework agreement that was signed by provinces. At the time, I think Paul Martin was the prime minister, and Ken Dryden was the minister, and before that, Jane Stewart. But it kept breaking up, and there was no legislative framework. And then when a new government came in, at that time it was the Stephen Harper government, the program got canceled. So by 2006, when there is a minority government, I thought it was important that we bring it back and have a national debate on what a national childcare program would look like. Why is it relevant still? Because we now have all these agreements, except in Ontario, and it's also important that there's a legislative framework backing it up, just like the Canada Health Act. And the reason why we have Medicare now, today, is because there was all these agreements with all the different provinces, and then there's legislation that backed it up through Canada Health Act. That's why we have Medicare. So the bill that is in front of you was very much modeled under the Canada Health Act.
So I want to ask Stephen now. So some would say that there's little that a federal government can do by way of legislation in an area of provincial territorial responsibility. What would you say?
Unmute yourself, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm sure people have heard, a debate about what the federal government can and can't do. And there will certainly be pushback from within the federal government to constrain, maybe what is probably the political ambition to go further. And that pushback will have to do with the fact that the federal government has no direct jurisdiction with respect to early learning and childcare, and has no authority at all to direct that provinces do one thing or the other when it comes to childcare. But what it does have, and what it's relied on in the Canada Health Act, is its spending power. So in a sense, the Canada Health Act and an Early Learning and Childcare Act could as well put an offer on the table. It's one way to understand the nature of federal jurisdiction with respect to its spending power. So it says to the provinces, if you want access to the funding that we're going to commit to and include as a feature of this legislation, you have to establish healthcare systems, and in our case, early learning and childcare systems that meet certain criteria and conditions. And if you do that, we will give you money. If you're not interested, that's fine. Not fine, but there's nothing the federal government can do to compel the provinces to take up its offer. With respect to the spending power, there is really nothing the federal government can't do which would overstep its constitutional authority. It could say to the provinces, you can have our healthcare money if every single childcare worker is dressed in a green uniform. I mean, that would be absurd. But the notion that there's some formal constraint on what the federal government can do is false. The constraints, rather, are practical and political. I mean, it makes no sense for the federal government to micromanage or to decide all kinds of things about the childcare system. It's not equipped or competent or close enough to the needs of people in a province to do that. And political, because the provinces always push back and say, well, we'll take the money, but we don't like the conditions. So it's going to be a policy and political debate, but it really is unconstrained legally in terms of the way in which the federal government can establish criteria and conditions for the province to meet if it wants federal funding.
So I'm going to pick up on something that that Emma has put into the Rabbi Shalom and Marcia has put into the chat. If you can see it, so there would be no constraints around the federal government insisting that funding only go to not-for-profit or municipal operators, and only to those operators who are unionized or commit to not opposing unionization efforts.
Good question for me.
Yes.
Yeah. I should have added the only constraint on federal authority would be the charter. So if the bill somehow offended the equality provisions of the charter or the right to life, liberty, and security, I can't imagine that happening, but that is a formal constraint. Labor conditions, there'll be a big pushback against federal initiatives the province claim go too far. And a couple of the examples you just offered would, I think, be greeted by that resistance. So this is really a political problem. And I think the point that I'm making is that you shouldn't be constrained by some notion of formal constraint. And you're much better equipped than I am to understand the political landscape of what would be feasible or not in terms of having the provinces kind of accept the need to meet certain criteria and conditions in order to access federal funding. I think the bilaterals, whatever you think of them, I gather they're called Canada-wide agreements now, would give you some indication of how far the provinces have been willing to go in order to get federal money. And that, I gather, varies significantly from province to province, but it's a political equation and a policy problem. And the further you go down dictating terms to the province, the more micromanaged the proposition, the more resistance you're going to get, not just from the province, but federal bureaucrats as well. I'm sorry, that's a general answer, but. Okay,
but given that we all recognize that this is a political exercise as much as it is a legislative one, Olivia, could I ask you, as somebody who's been to the table on this, what would the top priorities be for you that you think that no legislation should pass without these top three things in it?
High quality, affordable, nonprofit. Those are the top. The reason why I said nonprofit is because we've seen big box childcare coming in other countries, eating up all the money, taxpayers' money, and then the quality get lowered. You can look at the nursing home situation in Canada. That's exactly what happened. So they could start up childcare go for it, but I don't think taxpayers' money should go to it. Just like home care or nursing care. Schools, for example, good example. Public school, they can get public money. Private school should not get public money. It's that simple.
And now we turn to our participants. What's your view?
Before you run away, Carrie, let me just say one more thing. It's really important to make sure that we're able to get the legislation passed. Okay, I'll explain why politically. Having legislation governing the agreement is harder for the other government to cancel a legislation. Okay, there's a third component in the legislation that is advisory council. Canada Health Act has an advisory council which looks at all the different provinces, whether they are following this whole question about being nonprofit, for example. Okay, and that's where the policing comes from. So policing these agreements, policing these what's happening. That's a tough word for it. It could be enforcement, you call it. All right, it's really important. And having this legislation pass, first reading, second reading can be quite fast. Go to committee, get it done, have the third reading, get Senate to approve it. That process itself, if the government wants, can take, say, 2 or 3 months. Sometimes I've seen bill in the 6 years I was in Parliament, 8 years I was in Parliament, they can be done in 3 days, 4 days. If the high priority, bang, done, okay? Because there's horse trading as to which bill go first. I doubt that this one would be that fast. And it could go for 2 years if the government wants to drag it out. So I think it's really important that it goes through those process as quickly as possible so that we would have a legislative framework to back up all the different agreements that have now taken place.
Well, that's one of the questions that we have on the table for today. But before we get to it, I would like to, and Stephen, I will let you have a word in here first. But again, while Stephen is responding, either put your comments in the chat, put up your hand if you would like to make a comment. But the first part that we'd like you to consider is, what are the non-negotiables for you? Governments will not be disinterested in hearing from stakeholders such as yourself about what their fault lines are. You know, that if we do not see this in legislation, there is no way that we can publicly support that. So give that some thought. Stephen, you had a comment?
Yeah, so Olivia's top 3. I don't see issues with quality. I don't see issues really with affordability, though it would be innovative. Where there will be issues is with nonprofit. And I think what we did with Bill 303 was to grandfather existing profits, so that, there are for-profit operators out there. There are a lot of, in-home childcare. So what we did was we said, okay, those for-profit operations can continue, but they're not going to grow. All the new money and all of the expansion should be in the not-for-profit system. And that's one approach. But it's important to understand that it doesn't have to be one size fits all. That if there are, and I think this is pertinent to the whole question of bilaterals, you can grandfather, programs and policies that don't quite fit with the way you want this to ultimately evolve as a Canada-wide program. But you don't have to put them out of business in the meantime. So that's significant. I don't think, Olivia, there's a council in the Canada Health Act, but there was a council in Bill 303, and I think it's very important because the accountability mechanisms in the Canada Health Act are very weak and haven't, really worked very well. And I think the community would really want to do better than that, and the council would be a good way to do that.
There are some jurisdictions that have, some provinces that actually have childcare councils. So it might be interesting to hear from some of you that have those in place about just how effective they are in your circumstances. But this time is for the participants now. So who would like to go first? And you can go first, or I'll choose you, and then you'll have to go first.
I think there are some questions. One, a long one, big one, is David Philpott said, can they mandate provinces to consistently monitor quality? Can it be directive enough to force the province to collect the same data the same way?
That's actually in the Canada Health Act. So under the Canada Health Act, there's a regulation making authority. It's very limited, but it speaks to the obligation the provinces have to provide the federal government with information when it's requested. That could be put into the legislation itself rather than left to regulation. So yes, I think that's a fair proposal for the federal act.
Okay. Our chat monitor, please send the question to Carrie, okay, in private chat.
Yeah, I'm getting them. David, would you like to talk? You just did a cross Canada, had a chat with people, almost 100 people across Canada, asking them how they felt about this this period. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you, Carrie. I did a review of the early childhood education report, and we initially hoped to speak to about 30 or 40 people. We ended up speaking to well over 90 people because there's so much interest. There's so much excitement that we're at this place in Canada, and so much apprehension that in the push for more spaces, quality is going to suffer. And this is a sector where there's a dearth of data. We don't know what's happening. As one person said, we have 13 experiments across the country, each trying to learn from the other. So in order to move forward, we first and foremost need to collect data, the same way at the same time, so it's comparable, and we can use the data to inform each other as to how to move forward and where improvements are most needed. It's an exciting time in this sector. As another person said, these are the momentous years for this sector, finally, and we have to get it right. We have to have conversations like this, and we have to hold feet to the fire on a national and a regional level.
Morna, you've got an interesting question here. Would you like to share it with the group?
Thanks, Carrie. I'll just look at what I said to remember. First of all, I said, hi, Olivia, nice to see you.
I see that, I see that, I'm reading
for all
it.
your continued work. And you too, Stephen. Yeah, I think that one of the challenges around federal legislation, first of all, I think it's absolutely right. There's one thing about what you can do technically, legally, and so forth. There's a whole other question about what is going to be done politically. And of course, we're in a really different situation than we were in 2006 when the NDP, which was not in government, introduced legislation as a private member's bill. It's a really different political moment. So we do have to give some consideration, I think, maybe regretfully, about what's actually possible, what we could achieve. And presumably there's going to be a lot of negotiation, probably with the NDP, on the content of legislation. But my question really is the detail of the legislation, because the private members bill did not define in a lot of detail these principles that you put forward, Olivia, for example, affordability, quality, and I would add access and inclusivity to that list. The agreements do come some way to providing some detail, but I would be really surprised that we wouldn't get a law would not be challenged to make federal funding conditional on specifics like weight of compensation of staff, which is a crucial element to quality. So I sort of wonder, how did you do this? Because now I'm not saying it's still not worth having legislation that's vague, because there's a lot. The Canada Health Act gets used and cited all the time to defend certain propositions that the act does not actually address at all. So it's not that it's not useful, but I would like to know clear what you think about specificity in terms of defining what you mean by affordability, because under the agreements, it's being defined very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I
I think that's a problem that the housing sector is also experiencing, because they all said affordable housing. What is affordable housing? That is a political fight, and I'll defer to the lawyer, to Stephen, to try to answer whether you can define it. There are different aspects on the bill that actually, as I recall, that actually added in the Indigenous community, Inuit, Métis, and First Nation. I think that's also an important element that needs to be in it. But as to how specific it can be, Stephen, I'm worried that it will be, if it's too specific, it won't work.
Yeah, so I would share that concern, but there is some guidance from the Canada Health Act, because under, I call it Medicare for short, there is an affordability mechanism. It's, you get basically free healthcare, or at least healthcare according to your need rather than your ability to pay. And the Canada Health Act also has an interesting provision about reasonable compensation. They're talking about doctors, and the act in a way acknowledges the relationship between access, extra billing in this case, and compensation to physicians. You're not going to have access if you haven't got service providers that are paid well enough to work in the sector. And there's this extra billing provision, which would otherwise give doctors a way to earn more money, but is precluded under the Canada Health Act. All of which is to say there's some complexity in there, but there are also precedents for making sure that people have access to healthcare that's affordable for them. And there is also this provision about the service providers in the healthcare sector, at least the physicians, being compensated reasonably. That's helpful. Figuring out how it's going to work for the childcare sector is a challenge. The more structural the proposals in terms of putting in place the systems of accountability, and the easier it will be. The more detailed and specific, the more you bore down, the harder it gets. So you want to create a system that's going to work the way that you want without having to spell out in great detail every element of it. Sorry, that's the best.
Thank you. Going back to the question that we started with, Sharon Gregson has raised an issue around the profit nonprofit issue. There's three things that are in the early learning and childcare agreements. One is cut cost in half by 50% by the end of 22, get them down to an average of $10 a day by 2026. The other is some more spaces. In some, they have targets of 59%, and others they don't, but the bottom line is more spaces. And the third is the language isn't as clear in every one as we might like it, but that expansion will take place in the not-for-profit sector. So Sharon, can you pick up on that with your question, comments?
Well, I think it's just picking up on what Olivia said, that we want to make sure that public funds are used to build public assets and deliver on public good. And so it doesn't stop the for-profit sector from expanding if they wish, but says that public dollars will be in public and nonprofit and Indigenous childcare. So I think that's kind of a bottom line. It doesn't stop operating, but it talks about capital dollars being used the way that they're used for expansion.
You could use the Show-Dice Clinic, for example, that was grandmothered by through the Canada Health Act, that they continue to operate. It was originally independent for profit, and then it continued. So I think this will be a point that will get challenged a lot. That you could point to, and continue, there's no problem.
Yeah, it isn't about shutting anybody down.
That's right.
Whether they're nonprofit or for-profit at the moment. We need to build from what currently exists. So I'm talking specifically about expansion of the system that we need, and that would be using public dollars for publicly delivered childcare, nonprofit and Indigenous.
So what I'm hearing before we go to our next question is the non-negotiables, if you like, is that we want expansion to take place solely in the not-for-profit sector using public dollars, that we want to assure that affordability is a key tenet, that quality is a key tenet, and that includes that there needs to be a recognition of a professional workforce, and that we need proper accountability through either through the advisory group, sorry, and proper data collection and reporting. Is that a fair assessment of what we've heard so far?
Sounds like it is so far.
Okay, if you anything else to add, any disagreements with that, please use the chat function. And now we're going to our next question, which Olivia started us off on, and that is that there is a difference of opinion. And you can make up that slide there. There's a difference of opinion in terms of timing of legislation, that there is a body of thought that says we've got a short window to get this legislation passed before there's a possible change in government. And another train of thought, which is that if the process goes too quickly, we may end up with legislation that's too weak to be effective and it could even be harmful. So I'm going to open that up. And Olivia, you introduced that. Anything else to add on that before we go to our participants?
If you want, we could launch a poll and ask people what they think, or you could ask them. My instinct always would be, yes, do it right. But if we miss this window of opportunity, because we are in a minority government, God knows what's going to happen. I've been around the block many times. When Brian Mulroney had a bill, thank God that didn't pass because it was a nonprofit, and then it failed in the Senate. So I'm more inclined to do the get it done before the next election school of thought. But there are other people that thought, if it messes it up, if say one core component is not in it, then maybe we don't want one.
Any comments on that? Gord, I'm going to ask you. I know you're there.
He is.
I am here, and I just sent something on the chat, which is why I've been a little quiet, concentrating on that. I have a problem with this idea that now is the time for us to strike with the hammer to expand the federal role in childcare. I don't think it's true. I think that the current time is not very propitious for that. So that's why I have a problem. So I agreed with what Stephen Shyrman said about it being very much a political issue. There's not a legal prohibition on the expansion of the federal role or the use of the federal spending power. It's really a political question. But that means that what we have to address is now the right political time, when we have lots of power, to expand the federal role in childcare a little bit, right? Especially on the not-for-profit issue, which I agree is absolutely central, and on which many of the provinces are very uncertain. The way in which the feds are approaching this is very much that it's going to be very high level, once over lightly kind of legislation. Right? Yes, they want to state the principles, and maybe they'd be happy to have some expansion of the detail on the principles, but that beyond that, as far as they're concerned, all of the conditionality is already in the agreements, and they're not going to violate that. They don't want to violate whatever conditionality there is and replace it with some new higher level conditionality in federal legislation. So that's going to, we're going to run up certainly against what the feds want to do. But I think, and this is my analysis of what happened in Quebec too, is that once parents begin to experience much more affordable childcare, we will be much more politically powerful. Because that's really what happened in Quebec. Is, if you remember, Jean Charest, now back in the news again, tried to overturn the $5 a day, $7 a day thing. He ended up moving it to $7 a day, but he was trying to overturn Quebec childcare, and the parents were out in the streets saying, no, we love our childcare. We're not going to allow you to do that. We don't have that situation yet in terms of the political power of parents really loving the new system. And in my opinion, that's what we need in order to get, more acceptance of federal, a stronger federal role in childcare than we have already with the agreements. So that's really my problem with with the idea that we should push forward very strongly immediately now to try and get what, all of what we want in legislation about the federal role. I don't think we're going to get it right now.
Do you not think that voters don't care whether it's a federal or provincial government? They tune out whether when there's like, it's a federal or it's provincial, like they don't really care because they don't get like this and that and what have you. They just say, okay, the federal government has this money going in. Yeah, it looks okay. Yeah. Wouldn't they think just that way? And
yes, Olivia, but the politicians won't say it that way. So we have political, we have a number of provincial governments which will strongly oppose any incursion into what they perceive as into provincial jurisdiction. The idea that we're going to have a Canada Health Act is a very different view from the way we have it now with early learning and childcare. I mean, provinces will want to resist the idea that we're making early learning and childcare exactly like Medicare in Canada. Maybe we'll be able to get there. I don't think we have the political power to get there right now. I don't think we have the political force to get there right now. And that means that we're going to have opposition politicians crying for provincial rights, provincial jurisdiction, you're invading provincial jurisdiction. And we won't be able to overcome that with the power that we have right now, in my opinion.
May I want to disagree with that partially because, hey, you guys signed the agreement. You accepted the federal dollars. You accepted federal role. What are you talking about? Number one. Number two is there is a minority government. I'm just always afraid because it is not off. Well, maybe forever we'll have minority government. Perhaps, I don't know. Yes, there will be 2 or 3 provinces that would be really against it, but maybe we could ask folks that are from those provinces whether they would have much say. They are opposed to the federal government doing anything anyway. So I don't know. I think they will, but when the comeback is, you took the money, you signed the agreement. What's the problem? We just now have a framework around it. Wouldn't that be
So
an easy
we've got
argument?
a couple of other people who'd like to get in on this conversation. Jane Bertrand. You're probably muted.
No, I didn't signal a desire to get in on the conversation, so I was.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw you.
Sorry. I do finding it fascinating, the debate around the timing. I tend to go with let's get something there that holds feet to the fire going forward and we make it better as we go. But that could largely be because I'm old and I do remember the steps for how we got to our current Canada Health Act from 1962 when the doctors went on strike in Saskatchewan and it moved along. And it wasn't what it is now and it evolved, but having that federal role that jumped from what was happening provincially by the end of the 60s, I can't remember the date, seems to me to have been very important. I think there is enough commonality around the principles from the early learning and childcare agreements and the earlier early learning framework that we could have something that's pretty conclusive. And I don't know that we'll get much stronger politically, to Gord's point, than we are right now. I mean, the pandemic has parachuted support for this beyond anything I would have imagined possible in the short period of time. So I'm not sure how much stronger we're going to get in that with the implementation of the agreements. I think we're in a pretty strong place right now.
Thanks, Jane. Carolyn Ferns. You had your hand
Hi,
up.
this is a really, thank you so much for this. It's a really fascinating conversation. And I have to say, I've been thinking about it a lot. And of course, like federal legislation is not an area where I feel like, I know very much, right? So it's really good. I've just been trying to use this time to really like hear everybody and learn as much as I can about this. And I hear what you're saying, Olivia, that, you kind of want to strike while the iron's hot and like, this is a chance to move things forward. But I mean, when you say that the provinces will say, well, you signed on to this, so here it is. But if the legislation only codifies what's in the existing agreements, it's going to be pretty weak. If it tries to go very much beyond that, which is what we would probably all want, right? If it tries to go what's beyond what's in the agreement, then the provinces are going to say, hey, that's not what we signed on for, and you're overstepping into provincial jurisdiction. And if it becomes this big jurisdictional fight, then I think it's going to be, we're not in a very strong position on that, right? And it would become pretty hard. So I mean, I guess the question that I have is there what's the middle ground of like, how long can we safely work on this and hope that it develops into something stronger, where we're gambling that we might lose anything? Is there something that could be put in place that could be, and I just learned this word yesterday, scaffolding legislation, that you could have something in place that then could be built upon? So those are all kinds of questions that I have about it, so that we can kind of use, better understand what's the window that we have, what can we accomplish, that doesn't, leave us in a weaker position than we're in at the moment, I guess.
Armin, I'm just going to get some of the comments from our participants. Armin? I don't think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. I'm operating on two different media because technology is failing me today. So we're going to get a piece of legislation because it's in the mandate letter, whether we like it or not, whether we're ready or not. I tend to agree that the pandemic has catapulted the issue into public consciousness, and women in a she session that is not yet over have demanded support in a sector that was largely provided by the market and collapsed under the weight of pandemic economics, which is less revenue and more costs. So whether we like it or not, whether we're ready or not, we're going to get some kind of legislation. And I think the timing issue notwithstanding, the mandate is, Sharon just said the mandate letter isn't tied to legislation. There's a point in the mandate letter for the minister that says she will pass legislation. So it's like in black and white in the mandate letter. So we're going to get something by the end of the term. When that is, I don't know. Hi.
Can you hear me?
No, sorry, this is my daughter on the phone.
Oh, okay. So I would say that I don't know where we start, but one of the things we can start with is asking, legislating an advisory council to overview the information that we do have, to move the data that is required in every agreement to start conforming. We probably won't get a high for early learning and childhood education, but the idea of transparency and reporting is incredibly key. I was talking to somebody yesterday, I think, maybe 2 days ago, about the role of the EI monitoring report, which is an annual report that was introduced 25 years ago after insane amounts of reform to the EI system, which gutted supports for jobless Canadians. There was a demand to have an annual report on how unemployment insurance benefits were being funded and where they were going. And that was a 2-year pilot. And somehow 25 years later, that annual report becomes the main way we are able to agitate for improvements to how benefits reach jobless Canadians, including training benefits. So the idea that information on a regular basis that monitors how federally available systems reach people across the country is invaluable to us. And again, we might not get to high in year one. We might eventually get there. So I think an advisory council to monitor progress and to ensure that we develop a database is a least case situation. I would agree with what others have said, which is that given that we don't know what is the language in the bilateral agreements, and Sharon has asked now a couple of times in the chat, do we have any kind of timeline on when we actually see all the deals? I think that's an important question because we don't know what the lowest common denominator is. And the verbiage in Alberta about what that deal is may not match up with what they signed. So we don't know what the lowest common denominator is. But once we get that information, at least putting lowest common denominator elements in place would be very helpful to, again, as others have mentioned, in particular, Jay and I am also old, things evolve. And if you do not plant your flag now, this is a flag planting moment to strengthen maybe not the role of the federal government, but the reality of universal, affordable, high quality childcare that pays the caregivers well and makes sure that there's a good ratio between children and adults. And we're not going to get into the recipe for good childcare, but there's lots of flag planting we can do in that legislation. And by the way, I was not originally a fan of legislation. I was kind of disappointed to see it in the mandate letter because I thought, oh my God, we're going to be doing this. We're going to be spending so much time talking about whether we should or we shouldn't and what should be in it. And it's a waste of freaking time. But to Olivia's point, and to the point that Jane made, that the first versions of a Canada Health Act were different than what evolved. This is time to act. I think it'd be nice if we started talking about what we want to see in there now, and then perhaps table something in early 2023, because by then the 50% reduction will be in place in all the provinces that have signed the deal, which may or may not include Ontario. But then we have an election in June, so who knows what will happen. Thanks for inviting me to give my 2 cents worth.
So we got a short poll, and because we want to be respectful of your time, we only ask for you to spend your lunch hour with us or around your lunch hour with us. We got a short poll. We realize it's, that this isn't really a yes or no answer, but we're going to ask you to give a yes or no answer. Olivia, can you pop that up, or whoever?
Yeah. And I could also say that it's go ahead and vote. While you're voting, the government could put in the legislation, introduce it, and it can be amended at the committee to toughen it or weaken it, depends on the political work. So there's a bit of negotiating room if the bill when it goes to committee. So 13 of 28 have voted, 46% participated. Keep voting, keep going. Yes, no, I'm going to close the poll in about 2 or 3 minutes. Anybody else, or 1 or 2 more minutes? 46% participate. Can 2 or 3 of you vote also? No one else is voting. Everybody's on the fence. Come on, have faith. You don't see the poll, okay?
Oh, some people aren't seeing it. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Here is the result. 77% said nail down the legislation. 23% said take the time to do it right and avoid intended consequence. So that's the poll.
Okay, and that is, really just a straw, getting a straw feeling about what what people's perceptions are about. And again, this is the political question. It's not a legislative one. It's so. And what we've been going back and forth on is that, what is the political environment now, which would allow legislation to give us the best that it can, and also something that we can grow with. Our last question, and I'm going to do this very quick, and you may need to just provide your answers in the chat because we're coming down to the last 6 minutes. is, and many of you have raised this already, but there is the issue of equity. And we've seen a big disconnect between the government's earlier language that was in the ELC framework, in the budget, which was actually quite visionary. And then we see the language that's in the childcare agreements, which is largely more childcare for that is more affordable. And although by 20, because that is such a hard position that the government has, that the federal government has, is that fees will get down to an average of $10 a day, but we recognize that $10 a day may not be equitable. So have you given any thought about how legislation can promote equity as well as affordability? Okay,
Carrie,
Olivia.
Carrie, are you trying to get a poll? I'm sorry, I'm just being.
No, there's not a poll on this. This is something that we're asking. It's noting that there is this difference. Equity. Right.
Yeah. I think in some ways this question had been answered by Stephen earlier. If there is a need to make it affordable, if that language is there, then we can't quite say it's $10. $10 a day is a slogan, but it's hard for the regular voter. They would think, okay, I'm supposed to get $10 a day because that's the slogan, then because it's easy to remember. And how come it's not? Then I think having affordability as the top goal, then equity will follow. I don't know whether I'm saying it properly.
Stephen?
Yeah, well, I agree with Olivia. I mean, I think, I can imagine if you included the word affordability in the legislation, the question would be, well, what do they mean by affordability? And, if you tried to go further, you would get into complexities that weren't going to get you very far. In my view, including affordability and a council or other mechanisms that would begin to offer their advice in terms of what affordability is and are the programs at a provincial level actually meeting that test would probably be worthwhile. But there'll be pushback against something broad like affordability because perhaps it can be defined more readily than I think, and it requires some thought. But it's such an important principle. I've certainly tried to find some way to give it expression in legislation.
Yeah, I see there's a discussion about $10 a day. Of course, I support you. $7 a day even better, but $10 a day is good. There's also one component I think we need to say that it's that Quebec will get all their money. It doesn't matter. So this whole bill would not impact on Quebec. And that component is very important. It's part of the bill. I didn't mention it earlier on. There's a question about the March 14th deadline. I think it's okay to submit. I know people want to hold back, but the thing is that you can make a lot of amendments at the committee. I think the reason why they're thinking, because just drafting the bill and having it come out in the fall, because I don't think this government is going to last till next March. I think it would be next spring there will be an election. That's just my political instinct. So they will try to make it longer, but I don't think that it's going to be feasible. So thinking about the legislative framework, that is that if the bill get introduced end of September, early October, because there's a summer break, right? And then it would get into second reading probably and get to committee maybe in the spring or hopefully in the fall. Then in the spring, you could have amendments. It will come back to third reading. I'm talking about winter of February, let's say. And it will get debated in February, March. I'm just thinking through the timeline. And then it'll go to, hopefully if it passed in March, it'll go to the Senate. It will take 2 months. And then it'll be May, June, there'll be election. So that's about the timeline. So you want the government to introduce something at the latest by when they come back from the summer break, which will be in October, end of September. That's what I'm thinking of. So if you want to delay it any further, it will not get done. So we might as well forget it.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to take us to our final poll of the day. If you want to bring that one up. And I hope everybody can see the poll.
Yeah, I don't know why that people could not see it. Let me try it again. I will launch it and not touch it. Can people see it now?
Okay, and it reads, on a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic are you that Canada will be on track to building an early learning and childcare system by 2026? And
by the way, you can scroll down and do 10 if you want to.
yeah, it's not that we're only giving you
to
not as if the highest you can go. Well, some people figure that out, and we do have a 10. So I'm glad that some of us are feeling optimistic. So thank you for participating today. Two short but very important announcements before you leave us. Again, thanks very much for your input. All of the comments in your chat, we've as you know, recorded this session, and we'll do our best to reflect it in a doc summarizing your feedback. So Amis, can you give us 15 seconds on the Summer Institute?
Can you hear me?
I can, yep.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Our 18th annual Summer Institute is from May 30th to June 2nd. For those that have joined us last year, every day it'll be approximately 2 hours, different times of day to accommodate different schedules. This year, our Summer Institute is called the Early Years in, About, and For the Environment. We're really focusing around climate change that continues to impact young children around the world, both in terms of their access to the outdoors as well as their social emotional well-being. So it is vital that environmental sustainability is embedded in every aspect of the early years, from the environments that children learn in to the education that children receive about the importance of climate action and sustainability. I hope you can join us. We have a great line of experts in climate action, land-based learning, urban planning, sustainability, and incorporating environmental sustainability in the early years. So I hope you can join us. Registration will be open in April, and you can watch for that in our newsletter. Thanks so much.
And Olivia?
Yeah, Maya, do you want to mention it? This is unmute yourself. This is a United Nations session. Maya, can you?
We have a really exciting conversation coming up for those of you who are interested in global policy. Olivia will be speaking at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, March 23rd at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So my email, I'll also pop it in the chat. If people are interested, please don't hesitate to reach out and we will get you on the registration list.
Maya Roy, by the way, was former CEO of YWCA Canada, just joined the Institute for Change Leaders, and this is her first week, and we really welcome her. And back to you, Carrie.
Just to thank you again. We will post the final document on our website. We hope to have it up, or we will have it up before March 14th. And please feel confident that your comments will not be attributed. Be safe.